Slides up just in case there's any malfunction with my Wi-Fi or anything like that?
I do have the slides up in case we experience
Super.
any technological challenges. Yes, absolutely. So good morning, everybody. A really warm welcome to this Want to Know More About seminar. We're really glad that you've come to join us. Just if anyone's just popped in and isn't aware, we're recording the session and it will be made available via our PHIRST website. You'll get their website details on the slides if you want to go there to learn more about the work of PHIRST. But we're going to give you a bit of an introduction to us this morning. So this is part of the Leeds City Council Want to Know More About seminar series. But this is a seminar about a particular evaluation through the PHIRST scheme, where we looked at remote delivery of drug and alcohol services during the COVID-19 pandemic. I want to move us along to the next slide, please, Nigel.
Yeah, hopefully.
Hopefully it will work. We'll start by doing.
There we go.
Thank you. Wonderful. We'll start by doing some introductions to the speakers that you're going to hear from this morning. So my name's Catherine Brown. I'm Professor of Behaviour Change and Health at the University of Hertfordshire, and I'm Chief Investigator of our PHIRST team, and we'll explain a bit more about PHIRST, as I said, in a moment. So we've also got from my team, Nigel and Amanda. Nigel, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Nigel Lloyd. I'm a Senior Research Fellow on the PHIRST team based at the University of Hertfordshire as well, and a Joint Project Lead for this evaluation along with Catherine.
And Amanda?
Hi, I'm Amanda Wellings. I'm the public partnership person in the team. So it basically means that I run all the public involvement and consultations and work throughout the project. And this sitting next to me is Rover the cat, who's also a very important member of our team. He attends all our meetings.
And also we've got Dan Byrne from Leeds City Council. Do you want to introduce yourself, Dan?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. Morning, everyone. So Dan Byrne, the Public Health Lead for Drugs and Alcohol at Leeds City Council.
Super. I think we just lost the slides there, Nigel. Are you able to try resharing? While Nigel's doing that, I shall just start what I was going to say next, which is just to tell you a little bit about the session and what we're going through today. So Dan's going to pick up in a moment and just do a bit of setting the scene for this piece of work. So how did it come about? I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the PHIRST scheme and what that's all about, but we'll keep that nice and brief so we can get cracking with explaining this piece of work, what we've done and what we've found. So we're going to explain the aims of the project, the methods that we use to deliver the evaluation work, and obviously you should expect to talk you through the kind of main findings and recommendations that have come out of that work for practice, for policy development, etc.
Yeah, the slides all fine now?
Yeah,
Catherine?
I can
Everything
see
good?
the slides
Okay.
again now, Nigel.
Brilliant.
If you want to move on, I think the next slide is the session overview slide, which I've just talked through, but give people a quick glance of that. And if you move on to the next slide, I'm going to hand over to Dan for a few minutes so that he can just set the scene for us. Oh, where's Dan's slide gone? There it is. Perfect. Okay, I shall stop talking for a moment. Dan, over to you.
Brilliant, thanks, Catherine. Okay, so how did it all come about? A couple of years ago, at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, and following guidelines from the government around social distancing, our drug and alcohol services, like all drug and alcohol services in England, had to adapt in the service they provided in order to minimise the number of service users visiting them in person, which led to the service working almost exclusively remotely. And I worried about this because I've been working in this sector for 20 years now, and all I know is interactions being face to face, whether that's one-to-one or in group work. And I thought this could have a massive negative impact on people's treatment. It could cause major dropouts, relapse. But shortly after this started happening, we started hearing quite a lot of positives from the service users, such as they had more contact with the service, more meaningful engagement, assessments were faster and of higher quality, they were turning up to more appointments. we were having people engage who we'd never engaged in treatment before, and even people doing group work said that they preferred it because if they wanted to, they could turn their camera off and not be seen. However, at the same time, it wasn't for everyone. We had issues around digital inequality. Not everyone's got a laptop or internet access. There were also issues around not being able to see people when they were talking about what they were experiencing. And there was also impact on the staff. At this time, the NIHR put out a national call to do an evaluation of public health interventions, and I thought this would be a good idea. So I spoke with Ford Leeds, our drug and alcohol service in Leeds, as well as Basis and Joanna, who provide services for sex workers, about putting in an application to evaluate the remote delivery of these services, because what we wanted to do, we had all this anecdotal evidence, but we wanted to find out more. It was an opportunity to have it looked at properly, robustly, and systematically evaluated by a research team. And as we're public health, we're evidence-led, so it would be tailored to our needs. And we would then use the findings and recommendations to inform future commissioning, service delivery, and how service users experiencing drug and alcohol treatment going forward. When we were successful with the proposal, we were teamed up by the NIHR with the research team at University of Hertfordshire, and for the last 2 years we've been doing this evaluation in collaboration with them, and that's probably where I'll now stop and hand over to the research team, because what's important to hear is their findings. We're at this stage we're at now, which is 2 years later. So Catherine, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, Dan, and really helpful to hear that from your perspective, I think. So we move on to the next slide. I'm just going to do a couple of bits just to give you a bit of broader perspective on the FIRST scheme. So FIRST stands for Public Health Intervention Responsive Studies Team. And as Dan was just sort of alluding to, he's actually one of the first local authorities in the UK to have been funded through this FIRST scheme. So NIHR, National Institute for Health and Care Research, set up this scheme 2 years ago now. So we've been working since 1st of August 2020. And the idea is that local authorities submit expressions of interest for public health interventions that they are delivering anyway or about to deliver, but want that really robust evaluation evidence to support their work, to sort of answer important questions that they might have. So the aims of these teams, there are 6 of them nationally, are to co-produce robust and responsive evaluations of public health interventions happening anyway. Each FIRST is funded over a 5-year period and can bid to retain the status after that period of time, and they deliver up to 10 projects over that time. It's really important that we do engage in a process of co-production with all of the relevant stakeholders while we do this, because the research is meant to really meet the needs of public health and public health stakeholders. So that's all the partners in terms of delivering interventions, the service users or other members of the public. And we work hard to try to include all relevant voices at the table throughout the entire process. That includes in the design stage, through delivery, right the way through to the end point, where we're thinking about how do we mobilise the knowledge that's been gathered and collected and share that in usable and accessible formats. So that's our aim and our purpose. We've got a little video clip. It's just 2 minutes to show you on the next slide, as long as it works. We'll see if it does. It's available on the FIRST website, if you would find this at all useful to kind of share with colleagues afterwards. Oh, I'm not sure we're getting the sound on that, Nigel.
And I think there's an audio issue. Give me 2 seconds, see if we can sort that out. That's a shame. Might not be able to.
I wouldn't worry about it. It's available on the website and people are welcome to go and look at it, but it just sort of explains a little bit about FIRSTs and the purpose of FIRSTs in a bit more detail, and useful for sharing with colleagues if you want to promote the scheme at all. Let's move on to the next slide, Nigel. I'm going to hand over to Amanda, who, as she's already said, is our lay public member co-applicant on FIRST. She's going to say a little bit more about our approach.
Excuse me. There we go.
Amanda, you're on mute.
I'm on mute. That's a good start. Yeah, we have a two-pronged attack with our public involvement, or public partnerships, as we like to call it. We have a group actually that are based in Hertfordshire, and that's 10 people, and that's the university, the first PIRG, which is Public Involvement in Research Group, and there's 10 members on that. So, and then we have the project specific groups that we go out to, and they're known as public voice groups, and they work in the communities that we're working with, and we go out to them to do regular consultations throughout the project. We co-produce everything throughout what we do, and make sure that the public voice is central in all the design, carrying out, everything from analysis to dissemination, and we've done training for people to be able to be involved in as many stages as possible. I'll hand back to Catherine.
Thank you, Amanda. I'm going to walk you through the project aims, and then I'm going to hand over to Nigel, who's going to talk about the methods that we used in the study. So next slide, lovely. So the overall aims were to try to better understand, obviously, Dan and his colleagues were aware of some positivity around the experience of the move to remote models of delivery of drug and alcohol services, but they really wanted a much more in-depth understanding of what had kind of gone on and what the implications of that really were. So we were trying to understand in depth the impact that COVID-19 had on the delivery of drug and alcohol services in Leeds, how those changes in service delivery were experienced across the staff working in these organisations, and for service users, critically and importantly. And we really wanted to understand, had there been a particular impact on some of the outcomes for service user, and had some of the groups who receive services and who access services been at all disadvantaged relative to other groups. So trying to explore perhaps some of the health inequalities. We've also got some health economists who work as part of our PHIRST. So they've been looking at cost implications of moving to remote delivery of drug and alcohol services. So kind of exploring lots of different parts and aspects of this move and this change in the service delivery, with an ultimate aim of trying to think about what can we learn about how to best configure services in the future, making the most of what's been learned during the pandemic and using remote service offers, but really refining services for the future. Okay, I'll hand over to my colleague Nigel.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm going to talk a little bit about the methods. Won't labour it too much, but it is interesting to go through, I think, because we use some quite innovative methods at times as well. Went a little bit beyond what we might think of as some of the more traditional research methods. Just a bit of an overview of the methodology. We divided the work and our methods and our methodology into 5 different work packages, or work streams as we're calling them, and we've abbreviated those to the WS that you'll see there. As Dan mentioned, the work was conducted over 2 years, so September 2020 to September 2022, so quite a long evaluation, all said. And importantly, already been mentioned, close collaboration between the lead drug and alcohol support delivery organisation, that was Forward Leeds, and other key partners. Obviously, the local authority was involved in all of this, but also BASE Yorkshire and Joanna Project, who, as Dan said, do some very, very important work with sex workers. So we had regular partner and stakeholder meetings during the course of the evaluation, and as has already been said, co-production was very important to the planning of the evaluation work. We were very keen to keep partners involved and included in the decisions that we made, make sure that what we were planning was feasible, and essentially making sure that the evaluation will be generally successful by involving all partners and stakeholders in it as much as possible. Excuse me. So we'll take a little look at the different work streams, 5 work streams, as I said. The first of these was a systematic review of the literature on remote drug and alcohol treatment stroke support interventions. And it aimed to identify and assess the published evidence about the effectiveness of remotely delivered drug and alcohol support interventions. So a very structured piece of work, involved searching 4 databases of published studies, and overall found 62 studies related to alcohol and substance use that fit our criteria. Studies were rated for quality and how well they improved alcohol and or substance misuse. The term their misuse we've put in inverted commas. We'll typically talk about substance use, and in the UK, I think that's a sort of accepted terminology. But when you look into the literature, a lot of which is American, you'll see substance misuse and other terms that are perhaps a little out of favour here. So we had to use that in our definitions. So we've put it in there in those speech marks. And then behaviour change techniques as well. So we looked at behaviour change techniques that were used in the studies, and we analysed them in terms of how promising they were in their ability to improve outcomes. So the 2 key things that we did there really were around rating for quality, and then looking at those behaviour change techniques and looking at how promising they were. And we'll refer back to these findings as we go through the presentation. Okay, work stream 2, a really key work stream here, qualitative data collection from staff. There were 3 core methods that we used here, and 36 staff in total were included in this work stream. We collected data from 36 staff, and they were from Forward Leads and BASIS and Joanna Project. The first of these methods we'd like to highlight is this interactive timeline. As I mentioned, this was an innovative approach to data collection, in some ways forced on us a little bit perhaps by the pandemic, but definitely we gained a lot from using that, and we got very useful information. We really wanted a way to capture staff experiences of service delivery during the pandemic, and we needed a way to structure this so that staff would be able to give us that information in a way that was feasible for them. So we use this online timeline. You'll see an example of it if you can see my cursor. You'll see the example of it here. There's essentially a timeline that had a number of different months throughout the pandemic period here, and we pre-filled it with some key events, such as the initial lockdown, the initial lifting of lockdown 1, and then we invited staff to log in and then pull a virtual post-it onto the timeline at different points in that timeline, and essentially type something in there around their experience of delivering during the pandemic, or their broader experience of the pandemic. The example of the timeline that you see here is probably one of those that isn't that detailed. We got some that were very detailed, had 30 or 40 post-it notes on them with a lot of detail on them, and that all fed into the qualitative analysis that we did later on. The other 2 methods here, interviews and focus groups, more traditional methods. We did interviews and focus groups with managers and staff from those key service delivery organisations. These were all done remotely. And important to say as well that we included staff working across 4 substance use categories. So there are 4 substance use categories that are used in the monitoring and monitoring of the delivery and the outcomes of drug and alcohol services in England. And they are opiate, non-opiate, alcohol only, and non-opiate and alcohol. And we made sure that we included staff members working across those different substance use categories or pathways, if you like. Okay, then work stream 3, qualitative data collection from service users, and a little asterisk there with the about service users as well. We'll come to that in a moment. So 35 service users in total took part in a range of methods. Interviews and focus groups again were conducted with service users, But we're very, very aware that interviews and focus groups aren't always the most inclusive methods. They can be a little bit daunting for service users. And we wanted to ensure that we captured the experiences of as broad a range of service users as we possibly could. And to do this, we included an option for service users to engage and to participate via a text message conversation or an email conversation with one of the research team. Again, an innovative way to collect that information, a little bit different to what would typically be done with these sorts of evaluations. And then that final bullet point, we had some discussions with Basis Yorkshire and Joanna Project, and it was highlighted that sex workers' voices are often underheard, often not represented in evaluations like these, and we were very keen to capture those voices and those perspectives. So we did some excuse me, just change slides there. I'll go back. Yeah. So we decided to do some bespoke work with those sex workers. And that involved some of the staff who work with sex workers being supported via 2 workshops to then go out and collect information, have conversations with the service users, not do anything above the normal conversations perhaps that they'd have, but just to ask those women about their experiences during the pandemic, what they'd like for services in the future, how they'd experienced services during the course of the pandemic, take part in a creative writing workshop, and then write up 7 short vignettes, short case studies, if you like. So in that sense, that data was collected not directly from the women, but from the workers who work with them. But definitely, I think, gave some voice to their experience because those workers had actually spoken to those women and made sure that their voices fed into the evaluation. So we end up with 7 really, really useful vignettes. And I know that Catherine will probably say a little bit more later on about the similarities and differences maybe between their experiences and the experiences of other service users. Okay, then work stream 4. There were 2 components to this. This was to do with the quantitative data, so the routinely captured data that Forward Leads captures on a regular basis anyway. So we gained access to the anonymized data from Forward Leads, and as you can see there, it says N equals 8,653. So there are 8,653 service users represented in that data set. So a lot of data there. And there were 2 components to this work stream. One was an outcomes evaluation, and the 3rd bullet point there points to that. So we did a range of quantitative analysis, looking, for instance, at service delivery, contact with service users characteristics, as well as outcomes over time. So outcomes in terms of substance use, quality of life, well-being, a range of other things, and work closely with our statistician around that. And the second aspect to this work stream was the economic or cost evaluation. And this was an evaluation of the different modes, so face-to-face versus online, to understand the resource and the cost differences between face-to-face and virtual delivery. So working with a couple of health economists around that. And then work stream 5, this was really about bringing those findings together. So really about integrating and synthesizing the findings from work streams 1 to 4. So looking across the findings from the work streams, trying to generate key messages, key learning, recommendations, and then sharing those. This was an important part, was sharing that with stakeholders and refining those messages, really working to try to generate recommendations from all of that. And that happened over a few months, and it included sessions with service users that Amanda will speak about. So service users were involved in that. We also ran workshops with staff and involved more than 50 staff members actually in workshops to discuss and share findings. So that second bullet point there, that collaboration was very, very important. We've got various outputs that have been published as well. and they're available on the project webpage. And there's a lot more coming soon as well. These include academic journal articles and sort of lay non-academic outputs as well, some of which have been finalised and we're waiting for approval on. But you should be able to click on that web page. It should be an active link as well in the PDF to these slides that I think you'll have received, and then you can go and see what we've got available already. So very happy to take any questions or comments at that point. If anybody, I can't see the chat myself, so if there's anything in the chat, there are any questions or anything around the methods or the methodology or our approach, I'm very happy to deal with those now.
There's nothing come up into the chat, but just encourage audience members, if anything occurs to you, feel free to drop it into the chat while we're talking so we can pick up that question. We've popped in a couple of junctures to pause and just address any points of clarification or answer any questions, so do feel free to do that. I think I can't see anybody typing or waving or anything like that, so I think we're good to continue. I think we're handing over to Amanda next, who's going to talk about the co-production aspects of what we've done.
Hi everybody. Yeah, I'm going to talk about the really important co-production that we've done with service users across this this piece of work, and I'd like to draw attention to the piece of art that's actually on the front, which was actually done by one of the forward leads service users, and he gave me permission to use it, and I think it just speaks for what addiction feels like for some of these service users. So next slide please. So we, as Nigel alluded to earlier, we did a lot of innovative methods to reach underheard voices of the service users in this project. We did service user consultation at the outset and design stage. And that was really interesting. That was done online, and we had 3 service users involved in that. It didn't seem many, but bearing in mind it was in the middle of a pandemic, we were really happy to have those people on board. And one of the things that came out was we had a question which said, how far along are you in your recovery journey? 0 means you're just at the beginning, and 100 means that you're finished. Well, the service users really didn't like this question and said it might get people's backs up to think that they ever finish their recovery journey or that they can put a figure on it. So in the end, we decided that because of this and because of their really important insight around this, we removed the question from the initial intake questions that we had for people to fill in. So yeah, it's really good that they come on board and said that, because I think that we may have lost some participants because they may have been upset by how we were viewing what was their life experiences. So that was a really good piece of consultation. And you can see the picture shows what we called an activity, creativity, sorry, which was work that we did when we actually did some face-to-face work with service users in Leeds, and they were encouraged to pick up leaves and put their ideas on the tree, or we had staff to help them do that. So next slide. So we engaged with service users all the way through, and what we did was when we went actually up to Leeds to work with service users, we worked with 2 groups. We worked with one group from DASE, which are the sex workers. We actually went in and thought, yeah, they may be underheard, but we're going to go up and work with them and get their voices heard in the feedback. So basically we showed them what had happened and what our findings were, and we got their ideas about those findings, and then we went back and reflected back. And so it was really, we did it like you said we did. So we showed them the initial findings. They said, we then took that back, made some changes, and then we came back to them with a we did, so they could actually see the process of how their involvement was changing what was happening to how we were going to talk about this work. And we did loads of different creative stuff. I mean, the picture on this is what one of the ladies who's a sex worker, she sat and did some mindfulness colouring during the session. And the other thing we did was with the sex worker group up at Basis Yorkshire. I'm actually a poet, so I sat with the group and had permission to wig into what they were saying, sort of listen and take quotes, and also got them to give me quotes. And then as the session took place, I started writing a poem which is on the COVID DASE webpage, and the poem is their quotes. And as the session carried on, I would go back to the ladies that were talking and say, this is how I want to talk about what you've said, is it okay? So all the way through, they were giving me advice on how to do the poem. And I think using creative methods, I think, was a really, really powerful way of engaging with these ladies and getting their viewpoints into the work, and not something that is often done in research, but something that I'm really passionate about. And I thank the team for letting me go up and do this sort of work, because I think it's fantastic. So next slide. So as I said, we took key messages up, and we took them up in a really simple form, which was these infographics. So we went to Forward Leads for a session, and we went to Basis for a session, and we took the key messages up and talked through on tables using a World Cafe approach, which means that we just sat and we talked about one of the key messages, and then we got them to give us feedback, and then we took that feedback, updated the key messages, and went back to them, told them the updated messages. And in that second session was where we did a lot of the creative work as well. So next slide. So as you take part in this session, I'd like you to sort of think about things like, what do you think is the key learning for the evaluation for the remote delivery of support services? Or what do you think we can learn from the evaluation about improving access to services? What are the implications of the various evaluation findings for the work that you do and the services you deliver? What challenges are there for implementing recommendations? And what can we learn about including the public and service users in developing services? Can someone cut and paste that into chat, that would be brilliant. And they're just things, I don't expect you to consider all of it, but just an idea of questions that you might like to think about as we carry on with this work, and or you might like to raise at the end. So next slide. And I think I hand over to Catherine here.
Yes, brilliant, thank you. I have just popped those questions into the chat, and we just thought it might be useful. If one or two of those things appeals to you, to kind of think about it as we present some of the main findings and recommendations from the work that we've done. So I'm going to kick off with the first part of the findings. The way we've organised this is there's kind of 8 main recommendations that have come out of all of the synthesis work, all of the going back to talk to service users and staff about the findings. And so we've organised the rest of the presentation by each of the recommendations, and then we're going to talk about some of the key findings that have made us come to that recommendation. So some of the key things that have fed into each recommendation. The findings are vast, so we're not going to be covering absolutely every single detail of the findings because there's so much data across those work streams, but hopefully we've synthesized this to really bring out the kind of key messages and the key elements of what was there. Okay, next slide then please, Nigel. So this is our first recommendation, and that is that a mixed or a mixture of both in-person and remote services should be maintained into the future. And findings from across the work streams have fed into making this recommendation. The systematic literature review quite clearly showed that remote delivery of drug and alcohol support interventions can absolutely be effective. A lot of the evidence in the review was very alcohol focused, far fewer studies looked at other substances, so we need to be a little bit tentative perhaps in relation to that. And the evidence that we kind of systematically assessed up to that stage revealed that all of the sort of interventions that have been evaluated in this kind of robust way up to that point had been web or app based primarily in terms of the delivery, so weren't focused on the type of remote delivery that was seen by forward lead services and other services during the pandemic. So we can be fairly confident that this evaluation is amongst the first to try to look at this version of remote delivery of drug and alcohol support interventions. Findings across the qualitative and quantitative work streams indicate that remote services definitely offer, through their flexibility, improved engagement opportunities for some service users. So there's a real benefit to having that additional remote offer in the mix. It's really important, though, to identify that some people will just not want remote services. That is definitely not their preference. They much prefer to be seen in person and face to face. And of course, because of some of the challenges that people are experiencing in their lives who are accessing these services, at least some in-person contact is recommended throughout somebody's journey, even if they are engaging in quite a lot of the service offer remotely. So it's important to meet service users in person early on in their recovery journey. That's really important for building trust and rapport. We heard a lot about the importance of trust and rapport for that therapeutic relationship and that therapeutic alliance. And of course, staff will want to check on safety and well-being and in terms of safeguarding assessments and so on. It's really recommended that in-person meetings happen for those sorts of things. We could definitely see across the different work streams evidence that the remote delivery and the remote working that staff are engaged in, so often working from home during the pandemic, especially in the height of restrictions, has brought about efficiency for staff in terms of delivering their workload. So it's a good idea that we perhaps capture some of that efficiency going forward, and service users equally talked about experiencing that efficiency during the height of the pandemic. Certainly, we were doing a lot of these interviews with staff and service users sort of halfway through 2021, just to give you an idea of where they were when much of the data was being collected. And we definitely saw evidence that having this kind of flexibility of in-person and remote can essentially sort of add a string to the bow in terms of ways you might go about being trauma informed and offering compassionate care. So service users who, for example, may have some quite severe mental health problems, perhaps social anxiety, that was talked about a lot by service users, being able to access services remotely if you're experiencing some severe social anxiety can be really beneficial. Equally, it might not be beneficial to always be being seen remotely because you're not challenging yourself to kind of go out and be in those kind of public spaces too much. But again, with physical disabilities or illnesses, perhaps restricted mobility type things, having that option to access remotely can be really beneficial, so you can still get that support even if leaving the house is a particular challenge at that time. We certainly heard, though, that for some service users, It's not really a question of whether you're seen face to face at a hub or whether you're getting remote support. You kind of need services to go beyond that and come and see you where you are, whether that's at home or in another suitable place or location where you are. So that full range of mixed service opportunity offers is needed. And just to give you a flavour of some of the finding, you know, the data itself that's kind of led into this, there's some quotes here. I won't read all of them aloud, but these particular quotes on this slide are from service users. Many of them expressed having really liked being able to access services remotely. So there's a couple of quotes there really saying we need this mixture. Mixture is what we need in the future. Definitely not one, not the other, but combining those things. There's Alfie there saying the fact that he loved having that convenience of the phone call and receiving one-to-one support by phone. But equally, we've got Francis there. These are not their real names, by the way, pseudonyms. Francis there, who's the opposite end of the spectrum. Didn't really consider that things were a service during the pandemic and the height of the restrictions and the remote service offer. For him, he found that not a way to engage, and he was just waiting for the face-to-face services to come back. So there's always going to be some service users for whom that's just not going to work and it's not appropriate. And then on the next slide, we've got, that's just an example of one of the things that staff had noted. Whoops, back again. So this is a staff member talking about a service user who had a full-time job, and obviously there are people who have responsibilities in their life. Maybe that's work, maybe that's caring responsibilities. That means getting out of the house or leaving those responsibilities for too long is a bit of a challenge, and therefore remote services provide that opportunity to actually expand access for some people. And then we've just got some of the quantitative data covered over the next couple of slides. So appreciate that this perhaps looks a little busy, but I'll walk you through it. So we definitely saw in the quantitative data support for those experiences about increased efficiencies, as I mentioned. So figure 1 on the top left there shows the observed numbers of service users per month between March 2019 and March 2021. So the data that we accessed from Forward Lead Services covers that 2-year period, a year pre-pandemic, leading up to that initial lockdown month in March 2020 and then the first year of the pandemic. And hopefully it's fairly clear. So the orange line is the opiate service user care pathway. Non-opiates is in purple. The light blue line at the bottom is the non-opiate and alcohol service user group, and then alcohol only are shown in green. That data represents an overall increase of 8% in terms of numbers of service users accessing services over that 2-year period. And there's a definitive kind of trend in the post-pandemic year for that increase happening. And in particular, there was a spike across all of those care pathways at around June 2020. And a lot of the qualitative kind of data and conversations we've had with staff talks to that sense that as restrictions eased in that first year of the pandemic, they definitely experienced an influx and a flood of of service users coming into the service. And then the figure on the right there stands out quite a lot for us in our data. So this shows proportions of one-to-one appointments that were attended or where there was a cancellation or a DNA, did not attend, from the service user for that one-to-one appointment. And you can see patterns are pretty consistent in the pre-pandemic year, and then there's a significant increase in attendance that happens as the service moves into the restricted period and remote service offer at the beginning of the pandemic period. So we see attendances increasing for one-to-ones, cancellations and did not attends reducing. And then there's a bit of a drop off as we move through, and obviously some of the face-to-face services did return later in the year as some of the restrictions in the pandemic eased, and that sort of maps against a bit of an increase again in the did not attend, but cancellations remains kind of consistently reduced. So we do see a sort of ongoing effect there in terms of that remote service offer coming through. And then next slide, please. And these two graphs relate to group work in the pre-pandemic year and then the first year of the pandemic. So the graph on the left there is showing the total group sessions delivered by month, pre-pandemic versus during the first year of the pandemic, and you can see there is clearly a significant drop there in terms of the numbers of group sessions that were delivered in the first year of the pandemic. Perhaps recovering slightly to kind of get into the latter parts of that first year pre-pandemic. But then what's notable from the graph on the right is that when group sessions were being delivered remotely, greater numbers of people were able to attend those group sessions. So reflecting some of those efficiencies seen in the qualitative data and the experiences that we've heard from staff and service users. And the next slide, please. And so we can move on to the second recommendation that we've made, and that's that there's a need to review the technology, the training, the infrastructure and the resources needed to deliver a mixed service offer into the future. And of course, when the pandemic hit, services responded as rapidly as they possibly could to move staff to working from home in the main and provide them with the sort of technology and the resources that they needed. There was a lot of similar activity done to try to support some service users as well who might not have had things like mobile phones and so on that they could use for contact with services. But staff have sort of on reflection of these experiences, sort of talked about the need to, when you're kind of moving back to a hybrid model or a mixed service offer, it might be the case that things are still not quite right for that, and that this sort of the technology that they're using, the spaces that they're using in order to try to manage that hybrid model need to be thought about and considered. And we know from the service users and the staff who talked about service users' experiences that, of course, some service users have trouble with access to Wi-Fi, to digital devices, and even if they have those devices and the internet connections, they may struggle with confidence and ability to use some of the technology and so on. So there are barriers there for service users that continue, although it's clearly not just the responsibility of drug and alcohol services to address some of those digital access needs. There's a sort of wider issue at play there. And staff have also talked about when you're trying to manage a mixed service offer as well, you still need space in buildings to do that. So even if you're offering a remote service to a service user, you're talking to them on the phone or what have you, you still perhaps need private space to be able to do that. You can't necessarily do that in a busy office space where you may be overheard by other people and so on. So really thinking about how to configure things so that it really operates well for the mixed service offer in the future is needed. Next slide, please, Nigel. And again, I won't dwell on all of these quotes. They'll be there for you to have a look at and read yourself. But some of the sort of comments from staff and service users that have led into sort of that recommendation and some of the challenges around the resources and the space that's needed to do that combination of things. Okay, Nigel. And this is just a little bit of analysis from some of the health economic assessment. So I think often there's been a sort of assumption that if you're doing things remotely or digitally, that's very likely to lead to reduced costs or being able to do things more cheaply. But the health economic assessments suggest that's not an assumption you can make, particularly. So this is just a couple of examples of calculations done by the health economists from data that they've gathered, and that showed that for the group work, you're probably looking at much more expensive offer when you're doing things digitally, and that's mainly because it was found during that pandemic experience that you typically need 2 people to run an online or virtual Zoom group meeting, for example. So one person doing the main facilitating of the session, and another person doing a lot of the admin and the management of that online space, letting people in, dealing with people who aren't on mute when they need to be, etc. But then there are aspects of care that, when delivered virtually, are a bit cheaper. So, for example, the comprehensive assessment, which is done early in the service users' engagement with services to really look at what their needs are and gather that sort of baseline assessment data, if you like. That was typically a briefer session when it was done virtually during the pandemic compared with in-person delivery of that session, so therefore a bit cheaper. However, commentary from staff has indicated that might be a bit of a false economy, because what you're probably missing out on, the thing that makes it quicker and cheaper, is a lot of that rapport building that's really important in the early days of the relationship between the service user and the staff and the service provider. And there may also be things administratively speaking that the staff member needs to do in addition that perhaps would have been done in the face-to-face session if it had been happening that way. So these are things for considering. Doesn't necessarily mean we can cut costs. In fact, it might be a bit more expensive to do some of this work. Okay, next slide, please. So the third recommendation, I'm going to hand over to Nigel to pick up remaining recommendations, but is exploring, sort of mirroring that second recommendation, exploring how service users' digital access and inclusion can be supported. And of course, it's not, as I said, the responsibility of drug and alcohol services to tackle digital exclusion in the whole, but obviously it's important to try to address these needs if at the sort of beginning of a service user's journey, it's identified that a remote service offer would be beneficial for them, but they've got digital access issues or problems. It could be beneficial to look at how some service users who would benefit from remote could be supported. So yeah, definitely identified those digital access issues for some. It's likely that service users with some of the most complex needs are not going to be suitable for digital. So it's a balanced decision that needs to be made. During the pandemic, staff often found ways to kind of get support and digital devices to people to greater or lesser degrees of success and so on. So we definitely saw examples of that happening. And some of the things service users kind of fed back to us as well is actually they would appreciate things like spaces where they could go to access digital technology. They appreciated that you might not be able to just hand stuff out, but they would appreciate perhaps being given hub space where computer access was provided and internet access was provided as well. Okay, we've got a few quotes that just support that recommendation in terms of the things that came from the qualitative data. Again, I won't dwell on those now. They're there for people to read when we get the PDF of the slides out to you. Okay, I'll hand over to Nigel, who's going to pick up the final few recommendations. Thanks, Nigel.
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, as Catherine mentioned, Forward Leads carries out an initial assessment, carries out at least a couple, actually, of initial assessments of service users when they first engage with the service. And one of those, as Catherine mentioned, is that comprehensive assessment, and that captures a range of information. And this is information that could be very useful in deciding on the likely suitability of remote delivery for a particular service user. So this recommendation 4 is about embedding some type of assessment of the suitability of remote delivery into that initial assessment process. Underneath there, you'll see the findings that contributed to this. And amongst those findings, we've got, for instance, the first one's really about the uniqueness of every service user's experience. I mean, it seems obvious, but really our analysis really underlined how unique every service user is, how there really needs to be that unique tailored approach to meeting the needs of every service user. And the analysis suggested, as Catherine said, that it'd be unlikely that remote delivery is suitable for all service users, and those decisions really need to be made on a one-to-one individualized basis. So that information that's collected during that initial assessment could be really useful in deciding on that. Linked to this was the finding that mental health needs might be a significant factor in the suitability of remote delivery. So our qualitative analysis, for example, highlighted that, for instance, someone who's experiencing severe social anxiety might benefit in some ways from remote access, but might benefit from not needing to travel to a hub, by not needing to visit hub buildings. But on the other hand, those with other types of mental health needs might really benefit from that social contact and that getting out of the house regularly. So this is, as you can see, very individual, and the assessment information could be used to reach an informed decision about the suitability of remote delivery for different service users. And similarly, we found that the physical, social, and psychological support available to an individual should be considered and fed into that assessment process, because remote options might not be as suitable for those with more limited resources to support their engagement. Staff as well commented that service users should be informed of the various support options available to them as part of that consultation process, and then there should be some sort of conversation that does bear in mind the preferences, perhaps, and the individual circumstances, definitely, of the service user in making that decision about how services should be delivered and received. So I'll just move on to a few quotes here, as Catherine did. I won't labour them too much, but the first one, I think is an interesting one. It's about an individual. It's from an individual who was quite tech savvy, actually, but even though this person was used to using technology, they still really preferred face-to-face services and had real difficulty with engaging remotely. And I think it underlines the way that we can't make these assumptions necessarily about what might be suited to an individual. Partly we need to speak to them, but also that suitability and their preferences might change over time. So there's an argument, I think, there for constant conversations and engagement between support staff and the service user about what suits the service users' needs most. So this person, for instance, spoke about remote delivery, said it was a barrier that people just didn't seem to be appreciating how much of a barrier it was, and just the anxiety of having to negotiate through all those systems like I'd always worked in offices. I would say, I'm very computer literate, but you've got the added anxiety of joining those classrooms plus going through recovery, and it was really, really stressful. And there were so many times when I was doing the addiction classes through, and then they mentioned the venue, where I've said, oh, just let me know when it's face-to-face because I can't cope with it. So that person really, really wanting the face-to-face offer, even though on the face of it, they might seem like they were somebody who we might think would be quite suited to remote. And then that second quote, the one in blue there, somebody saying, I kept trying to access again. There were no face-to-face meetings. The facilities they were using was something called Zoom. Haven't got a clue about that. I've got a £10 phone and that's it. I've got no Wi-Fi or anything. So, as Catherine was saying, the differences between people in terms of digital inclusion and exclusion, about their access to the technology that they might need in order to engage remotely. Certainly, if we're talking about things like Zoom rather than telephone. Okay, I'll move on to recommendation 5. We captured quite a lot of data about the experience of delivering services remotely. So what was that like for staff? What worked? What didn't work? And this recommendation really comes out of that work stream. So where feasible, offer home working as an option for staff while providing opportunities for office-based working. really important to say that clearly this would be dependent on the nature of the service, the type of support work being conducted or provided, the type of work conducted from home. But the evaluation did highlight the scope for home working to not necessarily impede the effective delivery of services. So depending on how that home working was structured, how it happened, it was something certainly staff said that could be integrated into the effective delivery of drug and alcohol services. But I think the term where feasible is a really important one there to always bear in mind. So obviously during the pandemic, many staff worked from home, and the analysis highlighted some of the benefits for staff, those first 2 bullet points. So, for example, greater perceived efficiency and convenience. Catherine's already mentioned this a little bit. Staff, for instance, didn't necessarily need to travel to meetings or to see service users in certain cases, and they felt that this increased their productivity sometimes, also increased perceived productivity in terms of being able to focus on specific tasks when working from home. Staff talked about the benefits, for example, of not needing to return to a hub after a visit to a service user to do admin work. If, for instance, that involved driving past their home at the end of the working day just to go to a hub to do some admin, it might well be more efficient for them to just go home and do it. So that was one example of where they felt actually the facility to work from home really helped in terms of their ability to do their job well and deliver effective services. It's important to note as well, though, from that sort of third point here onwards, that there are also real benefits for staff of office-based work. They discuss the importance of those informal conversations that you can have when you're in the office together, the benefits of co-location with other team members, the benefits of that for information sharing and signposting, for peer support and team cohesion, the importance of being within a hub building for when you're engaging with a service user, being able to say, do you know what, this person can help you, and actually maybe take them to speak to that person. Those sorts of things were really important. So there's obviously a need for office-based working and a real benefit of that. And I think the complex and sensitive nature of drug and alcohol support means that regular face-to-face contact with colleagues is also beneficial. That came through quite strongly as well. So this recommendation is very much about home working being offered as an option where feasible, but with a recognition that office working is still very much valued and needed. And one final point on that as well, obviously we're in strange times at the moment, and there's a very tight labour market, and offering that home-based working component might actually be quite important from recruitment and retention of staff as well, because it's increasingly, I think, post-pandemic or after the pandemic, actually perhaps an expectation from some staff that will be something that they might be allowed to do. So important to perhaps think about that as well for those delivering drug and alcohol services and looking to recruit into the sector. Okay, again, a few quotes here. Won't go into them in much detail. That third one about the benefits of home working, the one in blue at the bottom, you learn from people in the office. You always got your colleagues to sound off to. You always got your colleagues to ask for advice, and there's somebody on hand all the time, where you're a bit isolated when you're at home, aren't you? So just one example there, and as Catherine said, the others will be available for you to read at your leisure. Okay, quick sip of water if there's a pause. Some glogging. There we go. Okay. So recommendation 6, review services and provide clear guidance for staff regarding whether each type of support can be routinely delivered remotely. As you can see, a lot of these findings and key messages have actually fed into different recommendations when we put them together in different ways. So recommendation 6 really derives from the fact that our findings indicate that some types of support, as has already been said, some types of support and services are more suited to remote delivery than others, and some are particularly difficult to deliver remotely as well. So clinical assessments, for instance, and comprehensive assessments were said to be particularly difficult to deliver remotely. things like tests for bloodborne viruses, for example, need to be face-to-face. There are certain things that can't be done remotely. Also, staff highlighted the difficulty that they face when providing support remotely in terms of accurately assessing service users. So that second bullet point there, staff talked about the challenges because they've got a lack of sensory cues, for instance. When they're in a building, they'll see how the service user walks. When they come into a room, they can see the whole of the service user rather than maybe just their face and shoulders. Staff spoke about the use of filters when they were having video calls with service users as well, and the difficulty in also with that relationship building and that rapport, but also be able to have those that sensory information, smell and look, and eyes, are the eyes yellowed and jaundiced, and those sorts of things. Really missed a lot of that. So there are certain services that it might be difficult to deliver remotely, and this recommendation is really about perhaps reviewing services and then providing guidance for staff about whether or not they should be thinking about routinely delivering particular services remotely, or whether routinely and typically they should be thinking about delivering those face to face. That final bullet actually talks about group work. And we did find, I think Catherine's mentioned it already as well, that certain types of services were more suited to remote delivery. Group work, in some cases, was one. Opened up the group to maybe a broader range of people, meant that there's some more flexibility about people being able to access it. Or where staff are supporting a service user for whom there were relatively few vulnerabilities or risks identified. Maybe where this staff member had been working with that service user for a while, where trust had been developed, where the service user's recovery was progressing well, maybe where they've been engaging with services for a while, and perhaps remote delivery would be more suited there, but less suitable in some other cases. But discussions with staff definitely suggested that they would benefit from more clarity about which services maybe lend themselves most readily to remote delivery, and where they perhaps should be thinking about not delivering remotely on a routine basis. Okay, and then yeah, some quotes here. I'll just read the first one out in grey. So you can't see black eyes, you can't see any jaundice, you can't see things that are really going on that you can see when you're seeing them in surgeries over the phone. It's been quite difficult because they're treating it as a telephone call, which is, I'll have a little bit of a chat with you, but it's not. It's been a session that we've had over the phone. It's been difficult to keep this sort of the recovery going for people. I think that, yeah, that's one of the major things. So something there as well embedded about when service users sometimes access a service remotely, perhaps from their own home, about the perception of that session, whether it's seen as an intervention, as a session, a serious session, whether it's seen more as a chat. That came up as well in quite a few of the interviews and focus groups. Okay, recommendation 7. Encourage face-to-face meetings between support workers and service users early, and so that's early on in the sort of engagement process, and where specific risks have been identified. And this recommendation is something of a follow-on as well from the previous one, but it's about the need to encourage face-to-face meetings between service users and support workers at the start of that support relationship, and where specific risks or vulnerabilities might have been identified, and then perhaps, if feasible, if suitable, moving to remote engagement later on, if this is appropriate. And this recommendation arose out of a few findings. One is that importance of the relationship and the rapport building, of developing that therapeutic relationship, that therapeutic alliance, and that staff and service users generally agreed that this was much more difficult to establish remotely than face to face, but that it was core and key really to a good recovery outcome, if we think of it in that way. Bullet points 2 and 3 Again, to talk about a little bit about those sensory cues as well, and the difficulty with assessing remotely, and also something there about that came out of service users mentioning that some service users said that they would be more likely to not be as honest perhaps with their support worker when they were being supported remotely, for instance, over the telephone. They were perhaps less likely to be honest in certain circumstances than when they were meeting that person face to face. So that's important to bear in mind as well. As that third point said there, it's easy. We did find that it's easier for service users to deceive or mislead those delivering support when support is remotely delivered. Obviously very individual as well, based on individuals. That final point there as well, a face-to-face meeting early on in service users engagement is a useful opportunity to assess the suitability of remote delivery. So again, sort of coming back around to that idea that actually there could be an opportunity there early on to assess how suitable remote delivery might be for this individual during that initial meeting. But definitely the idea that those initial meetings perhaps should be face-to-face if at all possible. And then a move to remote support later on if feasible. And there's some quotes there. I'll just read this first one. I know time's moving on a little bit. Yeah, it does affect things. So when you are, the therapeutic alliance is not built up over the phone. You can try your best to do that, but there's nothing better than seeing people, seeing reactions and how their body language is and things like that. And you can't get that over the phone, and they can't get that from you as well. They can't get you and what you're looking like and that you really care and things like that. And they can't see that. Whereas you can just hear a voice, you can try to get that over to them, but it's not as good. So a staff member talking there really about some of the drawbacks of trying to support a service user over the telephone, for instance, rather than face to face, and some other quotes there. And then finally on to recommendation 8, and then this is a recommendation that monitoring and outcome data collection systems should routinely capture the mode of service delivery. So they should routinely capture in-person or remote delivery. As Catherine said, the data that we collected a lot of it was back in 2021. And forward leads now do capture this information. So they do capture information about whether a person engaged in person or remotely, but this information is often not recorded as well, so it's not captured as well as it could be. It's not captured for every single interaction between the service and the service user, though there is a facility to do that. So there's a need to explore why that is, what's the barrier here, and also to improve those systems. So this recommendation is very much about the need for good quality data on the mode of support delivery in order to make effective decisions and assess whether or not remote versus in-person delivery is successful and feasible, and how it's been working in terms of outcomes for service users. So yeah, as that first point that says there, in the first year of the pandemic, certainly that mode wasn't captured, though it is now. Okay, and I don't think we've got another quote there. Yeah, we're back onto these questions to consider. I don't know if anybody's been putting things into the chat as we've been going there, Catherine. But just to recap there, I know it was in the chat as well, of some of the questions we invited you to perhaps consider while watching this presentation and listening to it. But we're very happy to, I think, take any questions, any comments, any clarifications as well. As Catherine mentioned, there was a lot of data. There was a lot of information there. We've done our best to sort of pull it together and give you a sense of what's actually in there. But this is it really is scratching the surface in some senses of what's in there. There's a lot more about people's experiences, about service user and staff experiences, about the outcomes for service users, about remote versus face-to-face. But hopefully we've done a decent job of trying to pull that together for you there. Okay, next slide. Just thanks for listening.
There's been a few comments and bits and pieces in the chat, so very much invite anybody who wants to kind of raise their hand and sort of ask a question in person to please do so. Mark, one of the things I've answered this in the chat already, but Mark Crow was asking about the sort of how do you what's the typology, how do you make the decisions about which service users should be having remote and which people should be having in person, and sort of absolutely he's sort of saying it's not a straightforward or obvious decision. There's not a kind of easy checklist that you can have around things. And I said, yeah, we completely agree. And the things that what we would recommend is that at the comprehensive assessment or very early on, there's conversations about what might suit a particular service user, and of course the person doing that assessment brings their own expertise, experience and judgment to that conversation as well. But kind of the key things that we really identified from the data is obviously the mental health considerations and how they might interact or interplay with a remote offer for that individual. The resources they've got, have they got the stuff they need? But also, even if they've got stuff, is there psychological kind of capability to engage in that particular way, and do they have the right environment in which to engage in that way? So you need, if you're doing that remotely from home, you need private space at home. You need to be able to have a private conversation. Not everybody lives in that context and that environment where that's possible. And how ready does that person feel to tackle substance use? You might feel actually they probably need more, maybe they need more intensive in-person support to kind of feel like they're ready, because there's a sort of at a distanceness to the remote, where you do need to have that trust and that rapport and that alliance kind of built up, I think, for that to work for a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that as you say, we can offer some ideas and guidance about the things that it should be considered, but I definitely think that idea about ensuring that there's that conversation and that assessment's very, very important. But as I think Mark suggests there, and we've spoken about it as well, Catherine, there isn't a checklist that you can use and just say, well, okay, then that remote delivery is suitable for that person, because it's so individualized, but and their particular circumstances and experiences and needs are going to be important in all of that. We're absolutely vital. But I mean, happily, those are the sort of things that drug and alcohol workers are so used to doing anyway. Is treating service users as individuals and looking at their individual circumstances. So I think, it's an extension of that approach, really, isn't it? It's having an idea of the things you might want to think about, having that assessment process, having that opportunity to discuss preferences, perhaps, as well as what might be most suitable and what might be available, and understanding that might change it is likely to change over time as well. It might be that something's suitable at one point for a service user, and then weeks, months later it's perhaps not. Very important point, I think.
Mark's also dropped some more biggies
Good stuff.
into the chat as well. He says, yes, there are efficiencies in the short term, but are staff able to sustain increased delivery, and what gets lost? And anecdotally, it's CPD, continuing professional development, service development. And that's quite interesting. I'm not sure whether our data really went on long term enough to really feed into what gets lost, but I guess that you get a sense of there are certain things which are just more difficult to do if you're not in the office having the conversations. We definitely had that in the data, didn't we, about how the cross-pollination that happens in an office environment, where you just ask a colleague for advice or say, I've got this service user, it's got this need, perhaps you could help out with that, which obviously feeds into the efficiency of working as well. And certainly some of when everybody was at home and wasn't in the office, or very few people were in the office, there was a sense that a lot of that was lost. I can imagine longer term,
I think
as Mark says, some of those other things go as well, perhaps.
I think there was something, that one was really about the opportunity where feasible. I think, you know, to have perhaps some homework, and if it fits with the needs of the service and the service user and the staff member, and the, you know, so again looking at it holistically, and when might that be feasible, rather than, you know, perhaps that idea of you have to work from the office at all times, you know, which are, you know, some organisations might be moving back to. So yeah, just that idea of, if possible, there might, you know, that flexibility, I think staff felt would be useful for them at times in certain circumstances.
I just want to pause and see if is there any other from the audience who may not have dropped anything in the chat but has a question or a comment.
Useful to unshare there, Catherine, or should we keep sharing?
Yeah, you can share. These slides will be sent out to all people who registered to attend.
See each other a little bit. Yeah.
Can't see anybody else jumping in. So just another point from Mark was around mental health and how are people accessing services for co-occurring problems, and if they are having challenges accessing mental health services, is this impacting on their drug and alcohol treatment? I'm not sure how much our data talks exactly to that question, but the comments that we did get about remotely accessing mental health services from some service users who participated, the sense from the data there was that the mental health support remotely wasn't always great for this for drug and alcohol service users. So definitely saw comments about how it just wasn't the same level of intervention when they were having, say, a half-hour phone call compared to what was a 1 hour face-to-face session with a mental health worker or counsellor or whoever that might have been prior to the pandemic. But I think it's that, you know, that the interaction between getting your drug and alcohol support and mental health service support is perhaps a bigger question than our data talks to. But yeah, obviously certainly one for consideration. Just seeing if anything else has got dropped in. I know there was a third question from Mark. Owen has commented, particularly interesting to look at encouraging face-to-face to start, even if support then moves to remote, something for our service to think about. I think, yeah, that one felt really clear to us as a sort of recommendation about, you know, obviously at one point during the pandemic, it wasn't possible to do much at all, if anything, with service users face-to-face, but that there's real value in starting things off face-to-face or having that face-to-face contact very early on, if it's not in the first instance, for that rapport building, that therapeutic alliance to build. And then if the person seems like remote would be a good idea for them, potentially moving to that offer where there's a preference for that. Amanda, can we share slides and video on Twitter as well, please? I'm sure we can manage to do that. Yeah. And I'll just move up to Mark's third question that he'd raised. I'm not sure whether he's still with us, he might have had to go, but he asks, how is remote service working for young people, the under 25s? Many of these also have co-occurring mental health needs. From the literature, it says this is likely to have been exacerbated in the pandemic. Yeah, we didn't end up interviewing anybody under the age of 30 for the study, so that's something to be clear about. It was all 30-year-olds plus in terms of who took part in interviews and focus groups. But the quantitative data from services obviously included all service users, and one of the findings that that emerged from the outcomes analysis was that those aged 18 to 24, so the young adults, the youngest adults in the population served, were reporting significantly poorer mental health or poor psychological well-being, notably in the post-pandemic period compared to all other age groups. And I think we have heard through staff when they talked about obviously supporting the younger age group as well, that remote was not necessarily the best way forward for young people, and that their preference was often to have an in-person appointment to see somebody face to face. And of course we can surmise why that might be. Maybe they already spend enough of their lives online, and they want, you know, for this to make a difference, and particularly if they've got mental health problems, perhaps that face-to-face support just feels more therapeutic, more in line with their needs. But yeah, absolutely, you know, this kind of co-occurring issue around mental health problems and those seeking support for drug and alcohol use is a really strong feature.
Yeah. There's some interesting stuff as well, I think, because obviously at the beginning of the pandemic there was perhaps a sense that it wouldn't last long. You know, so people perhaps thought, you know what, I'll wait for the face-to-face again. I won't engage remotely. I'll wait. This is perhaps only going to last for a month or two, and so I think there's a little bit of that as well, where some of those expectations about what would happen to services were there initially, and then people changed perhaps their preferences and actually ended up engaging maybe remotely when initially they thought that wasn't their preference. They thought that they wouldn't do that, but realized that the pandemic was wasn't something that was going away very quickly.
Amanda, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, when I went out to Leeds to work with the service users and whatever, the power of comradeship in the groups was amazing. And I don't think you get that on a video or a video link up. I mean, how they were supporting each other and how they were interacting with all the staff and whatever, it was just amazing. And you could share food. You could just sit and chat. They had the freedom to do so many things that aren't available online. I mean, you can't sit and have a cup of coffee together online. I mean, you can sit and both drink a cup of coffee, but it's not the same. It lacks all that social interaction, all that sort of friendship building and comradeship, which I think was important with the groups. That's how I felt anyway.
Dan, I'm just wondering if you wanted to say any last things as we're sort of coming to the end of the hour and a half.
No, not specifically. I mean, just thank you for doing the presentation. Obviously, you know, we've been heavily involved in this, or I've been heavily involved with it, and the services have over the last 2 years. I think now it's kind of like a really critical time, really, because obviously the drug and alcohol service in Leeds is the contract's coming to the end next summer, and we're looking at the next contract, and within that contract we're looking at what digital offers might look like. So this is kind of all very well timed, albeit we kind of did plan it this way, didn't we? A couple of years ago when we started out on this journey, we always knew that there would be it was a few years until the contract was coming up, and now we're a year away. It feels like a good time to now use these recommendations, and not just in our service as well. Other services around the country, we'll be talking to them obviously next month, and they'll also be looking at how they're going to kind of move forward with their service delivery. So this idea of a hybrid model is very much being talked about at the moment, and I think this is the first, if not the only, dare I say, properly researched, robust study of its kind at the moment. So thank you.
Thank you, Dan. That's why I muted myself because there's a dog barking in the background, which I thought you probably could do without hearing. But super. So I think we're a minute away from 11 o'clock. So I'll say thanks to my co-speakers for joining me today and for supporting the presentation. Much appreciated. And thanks to those who've joined us online today, albeit some have had to drop out early, but the recording will get to the website and the slides will be sent on for you. Thanks very much, everybody. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye, everyone.